talk about the world today, there's a crisis in mental health. There are teen suicide rates are through the roof. There are people with major technology addictions. Like just like there's an environmental crisis on the external world, there's an inner environmental crisis.
Meditation, being one of the oldest contemplative practices, helps us turn inwards. Turning inwards helps us understand the nature of our minds better, deepens our self-awareness, brings us closer to some form of internal freedom, and hopefully equips us with the tools to overcome daily humanly challenges just a bit better. Using the metaphor of an armada of vehicles, our guest today playfully describes the different forms of contemplative practices. He writes, "We have the yogic fire-breathing Namaste monster truck, the spooky Zen hovercraft, a Sufi flying carpet, a Catholic chain of bubble campers, and the boring mindfulness-based stress reduction delivery vans."
Welcome to another episode of the Soulspace podcast. We are your hosts, Adrian and Thal. Today we navigate the fraught territory of consciousness and meditation with Jeff Warren. Jeff is the author of Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, along with Mr. 10% Happier, Dan Harris. He also wrote The Head Trip, a guidebook to waking, sleeping, and dreaming. Jeff is one of the most honest meditation teachers I know. As you'll hear, his love and curiosity towards exploring consciousness is infectious. Thal and I decided to take a stab at some deep-end questions that relate to practice. Jeff tells us what it's been like for him since coming out publicly about his personal struggles with ADD and bipolar. He also shares his personal vision for the future of mental health. At the very end, he leaves us with a beautiful 10-minute guided meditation. Well, let's get into it. It's our pleasure to bring you Jeff Warren. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, we were thinking maybe to start off, love to hear what sparked your curiosity to explore consciousness. That's something that we both share as far as a passion and interest. But what comes to mind as far as early experiences that might have sparked that in you?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of always there. As far as I can remember, I mean, I think I was telling somebody about this the other day. I remember vividly being a young kid and laying in my bed and trying to understand the concept of infinity and trying to understand the concept that my mind was trying to understand infinity. And so trying to notice what that was like and getting these strange kinds of experiences or just vertigo experiences. And now I know, because of having done a lot of practice, that I was tapping into certain kinds of qualities or spaces, but I had no, of course, way to think about it or talk about it. I just would do that, and it seemed normal. And then I remember times that I would try to do it, and then it wouldn't have that. There'd be a contrast. Things that had happened before weren't happening. Things that I kind of wanted to have happen, actually. I'd be like, oh, yeah, that was cool. It was like I found a way to get myself high, and without even knowing anything about this, because I was a little kid, but I would try to get back to it and it would be different. And I would say, well, what was different? Why is that different now? And so that was sort of like an ongoing thing without being too, there was nothing really precocious about it. It was just kind of this, like, it was the same way kids will like choke themselves out, which I also would do and go unconscious and just notice the weird delays in time. And then as a young teenager, I remember reading an Omni article on lucid dreaming. Omni, if you don't know, was a extremely cool kind of psychedelic science popular magazine from the 80s. Probably started earlier than then. There hasn't been a kind of magazine since then, quite like it, but it had a whole feature on lucid dreaming and how to do it. And I remember like really working hard at trying to make that happen and had some success. And so that was, and there's other things I could say, like other kinds of the most meaningful thing is sometimes you go into a practice now, just like sometimes you walk around during the day and you remember a dream you had, not even from the last night, but like from a year ago. Have you had that experience?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So it's similarly in practice. Sometimes I'll be meditating and I'll suddenly go back and I'll remember an insight experience I had from many, many years ago. And recently I remembered this really profound experience I must have had I must have been like, I don't even know, like 7 or 8, where I suddenly got this whole insight into suffering, where I was realizing that I was just doing some kind of mundane habit, something I was just doing, and it was like I was responding to a situation and I was kind of responding again in the same way, in a way that I thought was kind of funny. But I had this sudden, incredibly sobering understanding that if I kept doing this, this would become my character. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I went into this whole thing around, oh my God, that's true from everybody all the time. We're on this little, like, wheel. We're going around this little, like, and we're just deepening these grooves. And I remember being like really shocked and kind of like scared about that realization, because I could see that some of the things I was in were not that healthy.
Yeah.
And that was, whoa. I still think about that.
So you were dabbling in altered states from a very young age.
Yeah, altered states, and both the kind of energetic high expansion type, right, but also the more the deeper, I would say ones that have to do more with being and more fundamental kind of questions.
Right.
In retrospect, I can see they were there, and why wouldn't they be? They're there for everyone all the time. That's part of cool things about existing. But yeah, they were on my radar, and then you go into like a narrowing in your late teenage years where I just was interested in sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and although that included transcendence and explorations, and the journey goes on from there. Right. And I could tell you more about the story, but that's a good start anyway.
When did you learn about meditation?
Well, a little later. It was for researching. I was researching a book on consciousness, so it was on waking, sleeping, and dreaming, and kind of trying to understand my mind, because that was really one of the through lines. And of course, I knew about meditation before, and I'd done a lot of yoga practices, and I'd done different kinds of ceremonies and things, but I'd never really had a formal practice. So for that, this is back in about 2003, I went on my first retreat then. Like, that was my first week-long retreat. And then, of course, everything changed, because now you understand that, these aren't just academic questions. Right. Not that I didn't know that before, but you could say there's a theories of dream, and there's actually having dreams and notice what's going on. But my academic interest in consciousness and meditation took a big turn there, because I could start to see that this was the place where I would be getting really the perspective on my direct experience that I was looking for.
Learning meditation and introducing meditation in your life in a way solidified your dabbling in altered states when you were younger, and like the mystical experiences and deeper questions of life.
No question. Yeah, I know, it gave me a framework to think about it. I mean, there are many frameworks to think about those kinds of experiences. I was familiar with some of the general mystical frameworks, but it gave me, my own, a kind of experiential map that I found helpful. I mean, so that's the whole story. There's kind of this, as you probably no doubt know, there's kind of this very interesting and rich ongoing kind of conversation or dialectic between our ideas and concepts and maps of what's happening and our understanding from an intellectual point of view and our lived experience. And they're both really important. That, often people in the direct experience spiritual world, kind of, they can be down on the maps and the concepts for many good reasons. But what I have found in my experience is that every time I, like, a good map, a good concept, a good take on something from a teacher or some kind of interest, a thoughtful observer, will allow me to see my own experience in a new way, and sometimes move me more deeply into experience. And then in turn, as I go into my experience, I'm able to refresh my concepts with what is the lived reality of this. So there's a continual back and forth where you're, and eventually I think one of the goals you could say is that the two converge and converge and converge until our model, our understanding of what's happening is directly maps perfectly onto our actual lived experience. And that's one way to talk about where our practice
Yes, absolutely.
goes.
Yeah, it's definitely all about the lived experience, because we can all get lost in the theory and the books. And so how did you start teaching meditation?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just say one last thing to finish
Sure.
that last thought, because you just made me think of something. The so the continuing interest in maps is really healthy. The continuing interest in those frameworks can really enrich in that lived experience. And so my progression as a practitioner was that I had first sort of my teacher Shinzen giving me a whole model or a map or way of working, then kind of being really interested in the progress of insight and how that worked, to use a different map or model, and ongoing like that. Every time I would go into a new map, it would give me a new way to explore, a new way to understand it. So there is this continual rich back. They're both awesome. Is what I want to say. Yeah.
What was it about Shinzen's specific framework that really resonated with you? It sounded like that one in particular, as a map, became very, very useful as an explorer.
Yeah, well, what was interesting with Shinzen is that he doesn't really have a map in terms of where the thing goes. He has a very rough map of like it, a general thing of it goes more and more into mystery, and his particular kind of his God is emptiness. It's impermanence. That's the altar he worships at, and that's where he lives. So that's the thing he's pointing you to. But what was radical about him was, for me, it still is the way he broke down the skills of what is involved in a practice. Like what a successful meditation practice needs to go deep. What are the actual skills you're building, like the concentration, the clarity, the equanimity? Those were his focus. So that really became my thing for me that I've now run with, because I think of that as, okay, how can I apply that to all practices? When I meet someone who's a successful movement practitioner or psychotherapeutic practitioner or depth psychologist or, shaman, whatever it is, how are concentration, clarity, and equanimity showing up? And what else is there? Because not to be reductive about it, what are the other skills that may be there? And that he gave me that way of thinking about it, which I probably had a little bit already because I'm having written a book on consciousness and I was interested in, but that made it, you can also find those skills in your direct experience. So that's my focus as a teacher, is not on any vehicle or any one form or any one technique even. It's more like, okay, how is equanimity showing up right now? What is the nature of that? And how to help them understand that, and then help them find more and more of it, and then merging it with the other skills. So that was his genius. I mean, people don't often think of him for that. He's got his whole map, and he's got a whole grid of techniques that he's really proud of that are really cool. But for me, the concentration, clarity, equanimity part that was like, because he could talk about it, how each of those skills led deeper and deeper into the path in a way that no one had ever articulated for me. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is the good stuff here. I mean, this is the thing I needed to hear.
After digging into the archives of some of your articles, I remember reading an analogy you made with those parts, and you referred to, I think it was a car analogy. I don't know if you can help remind me the particulars, because it was really helpful in seeing how different parts of the vehicle were those, those specific core practices.
Yeah, so that's the way it's a metaphor of just kind of vehicle versus parts. That my metaphor was that, you can just picture, Mad Max, the open desert, and all of these vehicles cruising through the desert. And there's the yoga namaste monster truck with the big fire breathing, pranayama people in the back. And then there's the kind of boring MBSR delivery van. Then there's the Vipassana, body scan, vibratory impermanence wave that's floating over here, and the all the different vehicle. You can think of each vehicle as a different technique or a different form. And they would include not just meditation vehicles from Zen and Buddhism and from Hindu practice, but non-dual vehicles, but also movement practices and pranayama practices and artistic practices, humanistic practices, and psychotherapeutic practices. All these practices, you can think of all the world's ways in which they've started with this basic recognition that living is a training, and that practice is being deliberate about that training, about how you want to live. And here's the armada. And so people get confused. They're like, well, which vehicle should I get in? Because it's overwhelming. You've got there's thousands of vehicles. And my whole thing is, well, it's not so much the vehicle is important and wonderful and beautiful. And there's a lot about the specifics of each vehicle which are important to understand and wonderful to learn. But insofar as any vehicle is going to make it through the desert, it's always going to have certain parts that are the universal. So that's the analogy I would say is the concentration is always going to be there. And that's really the steering system. Every vehicle has a steering system. You need to have the capacity to hold the direction, to devote your attention in some direction and not being blown out in 50 directions. So that single pointed quality of concentration and devotion is always going to be there. There's always going to be an equanimity component, which is sort of like the grease in the engine, in all the parts. That's what allows things to move fluidly. Equanimity being the smoothness, the ability to open to the actual moment, to accept what's going on. There is no way you can deepen in any practice and not have that. It's just impossible. Maybe there's someone who can point me to an exception. I've yet to hear it. I'd love to hear one. So sorry for the reckless generalizing, but this has been my life as an explorer, that I'm always looking. So I would say those two are the absolute for sure needed. There's a clarity piece that I think is sort of an optional one. It's related to the awareness piece, to how deliberately aware you're becoming. It's like the windshield. Many practices have it. Definitely Vipassana, definitely non-dual practices, definitely certain yogic practices. Some don't have a deliberate emphasis on it, but it's a byproduct that you become more aware. You start to become aware of more and more stuff. But there are lots of practices that don't emphasize the awareness, and that's often where you have the problems. Like people have these shadows that they don't ever bother looking at. They develop the freedom from the equanimity and the concentration, a lot of power, a lot of freedom, but they don't see the way that they're basically fucking up stuff around them. Because they have these big shadows. It's a real problem in this, as you know, in the spiritual path. So I think the clarity piece should be part of it, and that clarity and awareness piece. But so those are three, and then I would say there's a friendliness piece too, which is just like, I hope you're developing compassion.
Yeah.
I really hope so. And it's another muscle group, and I would say it's sort of like the, I don't know, I haven't figured out the metaphor for what that is. Maybe it's the perfume around your vehicle. Maybe it's
the tunes, the music.
Nice, dude. So it's like some Bob Marley on the stereo, or maybe it's something loving, and it puts people in a warm space. And that comes spontaneously, of course, from a practice. The reason it's not deliberate is that in a lot of practices it just emerges. That's what happens when the heart is opened. It starts to just come from our own contact with our own being. In a way, but then of course lots of practitioners deliberately cultivate it, like within every tradition, and I think it's a good idea.
As a fellow explorer, I do agree with you. It's so hard not to get not distracted, but to get attracted to other forms of practices and not just focus on one type. And so my question is, how do you balance? Because I know I've struggled with that, where I was like, am I just, a jack of all trades? I'm doing all these things and not going deep into one practice. But in retrospect, from my own experience, I know that I was doing a lot of spiritual bypassing when I was focusing on just one practice. And when I introduced psychotherapy in my life as a spiritual practice, more than just exploring my own mental health issues, that's when things were like completely exploded in my face. So yes. I don't know. Yeah.
Great question. I mean, it's the $1 million question. And it's so important. And I can tell you my personal answer, but ultimately this idea that choose one thing and stay with it is somehow always the right thing is not true. It's really about the individual has to understand what's right for them. For a lot of people, it is really important to just choose one thing and to have that commitment. And I would say certainly when you're doing your practice, it's important to have that one-pointed commitment, to be developing that capacity for devotion and concentration. But for other people, they're able to explore different techniques and find synergies, find that there's a lot of complementarities. It doesn't confuse or overwhelm them and make things more complex or more overly complicated. I would say the way that I've dealt with the ADD question, which is kind of what you're asking, isn't that all just a bit ADD? And the answer is yes, because I'm ADD. And the way I've dealt with it is it's through exactly what I've been describing. When I realized that it doesn't matter what practice I do, I'm always cultivating the equanimity. There's a move I can do in my body. I can guide you guys through it right now. There's a move I do in my body to make sure that I'm equanimous. There's a move I do that ensures that I'm at least being concentrated. There's a move I do that's around being aware and being clear. Those are the skills that are always getting built. Those are my vehicles in a weird way, even though they're the parts. So I can go into different practices and basically approach them as a mindfulness practice of like, okay, I'm just being aware of the things I'm training for it. So,
since you brought it up, we wanted to actually ask you about, you came out recently on Dan's podcast and talked about your ADD and your personal struggle as a meditation teacher. I mean, that for us is really important because it's easy, at least for me, I feel like it's easy to walk around and carry this persona, even as a meditator, that you somehow have all your shit figured out and, that your internal landscapes are all clean and always, in bliss states. But clearly it's not the case. And could you share a little bit about how your relationship to ADD or your experience of it, if it's changed at all since talking about it more openly?
Yeah, great question. Well, it has changed. My relationship to it has changed. It's not just the ADD. I have ADD. I also have a lot of emotional intensity and dysregulation. I had a bipolar diagnosis a year ago, which was kind of a surprise, but also not a surprise. And that just means like big spikes, where I have a lot of energy. Even you can feel it when I'm in this conversation. I get excited about something. It's like, woohoo, here we go. And that can lead into sort of hypomanic states. And then there's a crash, right, as I'm exhausted and really despairing. So first of all, it takes a while to see clearly your own struggles. Like, I've always known about the ADD. I've kind of known about the ups, but I didn't really have the perspective on the ups and downs until it's still an ongoing thing where I learn new things about myself. And the challenge is, can you be honest even with that? When there's so much expectation from people, for the people who are teaching them to somehow be, like you said, totally perfect, and you internalize all these assumptions and ideals. And so the experience of writing a book with Dan, the Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics book, and going on the Joe Rogan podcast and talking about it was quite liberating, because it was sort of like, I'm just going to admit it. This is what I had kind of talked about it before, and I've always tried to be an honest teacher in that way. But like I said, I had sort of secret pockets of shame about it that I didn't know I was holding back. So to kind of just put it all out there, it was very liberating, and because what you realize is you're not going to change fundamental ways of how you are, or maybe you will very, very slowly. All of us, it takes a long time to be able to live outside of conditioning. And those conditions are going to be a big part of your life for most of your life. And the rough arc of those conditions is not going to change in a huge way. Certain parts will change. Like, there's aspects of my challenges that are due to physical trauma and other things that as I learn to discharge that energy, I'll be able to definitely, the ups and the highs and lows of my bipolar thing will start to shrink, and they've already started to. Definitely the ADD can start to come into more regulation. So there are ways in which we can begin to modify it, but I'll always be someone who is sensitive, who has ups and downs, who's a little bit scattered, who's creative. That's part of and so kind of the journey is like just, oh yeah, the adult quality of accepting that and not needing to be any different. And then learning how to work with it. Like, given that I'm already like this, and I know I don't have to now put on myself all the shit about how I'm somehow supposed to be different. And it's like, I know what I'm good at doing and what I'm not good at doing. You know what? I had to get an assistant to help me with organizational stuff. I have a life coach I just hired to help me with organizational stuff. You know, you got to put the environmental things in that are gonna help you. And so this process has really allowed me to do that. That's one answer. There's an even deeper answer, which is the thing is, all the way through the struggle of it, I've been paying attention. What works, what doesn't work from using these practices. So I've learned a lot about how to use mindfulness to change my relationship to the energies and back off and not feed them. So I can really early on, just like I did in this podcast, oh, I'm tracking that I'm starting to go up, I back off. Like I'm backing off right now. Take a breath out, I let it pass. And then in the same way, I can start to learn to do that with the down energies, which are harder because they're gnarly.
Yeah.
So that stuff what's our job here? It's to teach your suffering, teach your healing. And then I can bring that to my teachings. So I'm really focused on that. Like, what do I do day to day that helps me with it? And then how can I pay that forward?
That's awesome. I mean, as a student of transpersonal psychology, I can tell you that in many ways, mainstream psychology uses labels and which are important, but they can be limiting. And you can see how a lot of your creativity comes from those intense emotions, and that's okay.
It's okay, but it's a pain in the ass.
It is. I know from personal experience. So I feel you.
Yeah. How do you work with it?
Same thing. I'm just, more practice is what's helping. For me, my bypassing was through books for a long time, as you can see.
Me too.
Yeah. So practice is very important. That's all I can say.
How do you metabolize? Do you have energies that you work with that are really challenging?
Anger.
That too.
Yeah. Lots of anger.
And how do you transmute it? What's your alchemical process?
You know what? I actually just dive deep into it, and it takes me back to certain moments in my life, like certain scenarios, and I just live through that moment and just, sort of comfort myself through that moment, and it just like that charge just goes away, and when I revisit that moment at a later date, it's like, why was I that angry? So yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we'd like to go into more mystical questions. The word, even mysticism and the word spirituality, a lot of people are like, ooh, what do they mean to you?
They're about questions of being and belonging. They're the fundamental questions of that. Here we are. They're what people some people from a philosophical bent would call existential questions. We get busy with life, and we get busy with the kind of operational side of life, and many of us forget that actually we're inside this enormous mystery. We don't know how we got here. Really got here. We can have all the explanations we want about biology and physics, but which is all legitimate and wonderful. But there's a larger mystery of why there's something in the first place, and why it feels like something to be alive, and what is the nature of awareness, and what is the relationship between how we're aware in the world around us and each other. And these are very, very, very fundamental questions. And for some people, they never fall off the map. They never fall off the kind of table of concerns. You may get preoccupied with your life, but there's sort of it's like life still has this existential highlighter under it, where you're just a little bit wondering about the periphery. Like, why is that?
The big questions, yeah.
The big questions. And so that was, for me, they never fell off the table. Like when I was a kid, I was interested in them, and I just stayed interested. And eventually I realized, oh, wow, because I was an atheist at the time, because I thought I didn't have enough way to understand that there was something soulful about spirituality or religion. I just heard the negative side of it and saw the negative side. So I didn't know, I thought the only way into this inquiry was through philosophy. I didn't know you could actually feel into the inquiry. So I would say mysticism, spirituality are attempts to feel, to directly experience the mystery, these fundamental questions of being. And what we learn is that these aren't just academic questions, that the way we feel into them, the orientations we make in our own experience, change what we begin to understand about the nature of that mystery, the nature of the being, the beingness, whatever you want to call it, and that there are always going to be mysteries there, but that certain parts of that mystery can start to be resolved in a very interesting way, like the question of who we are, which we think of as, this academic question, and actually you can know who you are. There's an answer to that. It's an ongoing answer, but it gets more and more deep and more vivid, the responses to that. So that would be how I would describe what mysticism is. Oh, just got stung by a small bee. He said, hello, don't forget the mystery. Actually, wasn't a sting, just a little tap.
That's awesome.
Jeff, I'd love to hear you talk about just along the lines of different experiences of the nature of mind. And you hear people bring terms up like non-duality, like non-dual states, and the experience of it. Not so much, finding a universal definition, but just what can you share about that? Talking to others and having personal experiences about specific states we can have that changes your concept of who you are. I mean, the experience of who you are, not the definition of it.
Yes. I can talk a lot about this. It's my favorite subject. It's kind of like where to start, because as someone who wrote about consciousness and was a journalist about it, I was interested in this from the beginning. And so I spent many years interviewing teachers and practitioners about these subjects, but also many years exploring on my own. So I have both a kind of intellectual understanding of what it is that I could speak to, and that intellectual understanding is never completed. I'm always dissatisfied with it because I know it barely even points to what the thing is. And I'm always updating it because there's a continual process of saying, I was sort of naive about that, or I can see how my early questions around were really kind of more naive, and as I get more experience, I get more sober around it. But then I'm more comfortable even, I would say, talking about my own experience. And my own experience is, first of all, I consider myself to be still very early in the path. And I have people in my life and teachers I admire who are very, very, very deep in what I would call a more non-dual state, meaning so this is where it gets already, you're trying to define it, meaning they are in a vivid relationship with the big picture. The big picture of who they are, the big picture of their own life. Sometimes that's experienced through emptiness, through a sense that there's a kind of emptiness all around them that is both who they are and continually refreshing them. Sometimes it's experienced through more of a sense of unity, and that there's unity in these things too. So the analogy is, the classic analogy that I like that fits with my own experience is this idea of a crystal. So there's a crystal, and we go around and around the crystal, which is our own being, and we polish different facets of the crystal. So every time, and you're continually making a pass around the crystal, you polish this facet. And one facet is this facet of emptiness. And it's possible the emptiness facet is somehow more privileged or deeper or more fundamental than all the others. That's possible.
Right, yeah.
And then you have the facet of unity, of just like, which can be, there's different facets of the facet of unity. It can be just that there's no inner activation and you're so completely open to the world, there's only the world. That's a more accessible end of it. But there are also ends of it where you literally feel yourself to be everything you're looking at, and it's looking back at you, which my teacher Shinzen has. That's another facet of unity. There are other facets, like a spacious facet, which is one that I have a lot. There's facets, there's a kind of love or a heartbreak intimacy, like,
Yeah. I've had that one.
You know that one where you're just like, oh my God. The sacredness, which is a spaciousness and a unity and an emptiness and a love, and it's the love. It's like, oh my God. So there's these different facets that come to the fore. And for me as a practitioner, I would fall into one of these facets at a meditation retreat or in a ceremony, and I would think, oh my God, this is it. This is the thing. I now know what they're talking about. Yeah, I'm here now. And then two things would happen. One, I would no longer be there. And I'm like, oh shit. So it would fade. Sometimes it would fade almost immediately. Sometimes it would fade after a few hours. Sometimes it would fade after a few weeks. I mean, I had experiences of being deep in kind of space, spacey, but open, spacious, intimate thing for weeks. Sometimes preceded by something dramatic. Sometimes I just kind of gradually got there. And I would be in it for a while, and then it would just fade out. That's one thing that would happen. It would fade. But then what would happen is I would subtly reify that thing, and I'd be trying to get back to it. And it took me years to realize that, oh, that was just one facet. Because the next time I got back to it, it wasn't that. It was something else. It was a different facet.
And different and maybe better.
Well, it was, yeah, and exactly. And often it was like, oh, no, this is the real one. It was just a shadowy version of this much more real one, which now is hopefully going to be here for a longer time. I never think that now. Now, as my teacher Shinzen would say, the small self always comes back. The small self. Yes. I mean, that's, you want to use that language, but the relative world, the contraction, the conditioning, it comes back. But what I've noticed over the years, and so the only thing what I can say is most true about my experience is that I feel like it's easier to find all the time, more and more. That I still forget, but then as soon as just talking about it right now, it's very immediate for me. Mm-hmm. It's there as a feeling. I can't even, there's no words, it's like a direction. I can feel this, it's like a kind of a charge in my experience, a fullness, a kind of, ooh, yeah. And it's very centering too. That's there, and it's there more and more when I want it. And I had for many years, I reified this particular kind of cessation experience I thought you needed to have that would officially bring me into stream entry. Because I was into the models of stream entry, I was into progressive insight, I was into Shinzen, super into stream entry, pragmatic dharmas into stream entry, Daniel Ingham, all these people, whatever. I was like, yeah, I'm going to get stream entry, and I'm going to have this experience of stream entry, which is going to be a cessation. I'm going to go through the emptiness door, the impermanence door, as opposed to the suffering door, which is really the door I was going through again and again. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, but I don't like this door. It really fucking hurts. But I'm like, but that's the door I was going through. But anyway, I'm like, no, I want and what I didn't realize at the time was that people go through that kind of a door have a particular kind of brain. They're like kind of Asperger's-y flavored nerds who tend to be really good at concentration and really good at clarity, and they get the kind of disappear. And so I was trying to make that happen, but I was too ADD to get that to happen because I just didn't have a good enough concentration. And so it took me years to just stop to get wise and to stop trying to get enlightened and stop trying to get stream entry and stop trying to compare myself to anybody else and just embrace the fact that I have no clue where I am on any map. I know I'm technically in the stream in the sense that like the stream of my practice and the stream of my experience is now just taking me places. Like I don't have to do anything. It just happens whether I want it or not. And so I still practice deliberately, but I can feel the momentum. It's like, and sometimes I wish it wasn't there because it's knocking me through walls. Sometimes like bam, bam, bam. It's like a train that's just like going forward now. And sometimes you're smashing through big dry brushes full of thorns. And sometimes you're in these great views. And other times you're like knocking through a wall or running over somebody. Not quite. So that's, hopefully those are some models and some ways of talking about it. There's probably lots more I could say. I don't even know why I said that, but that's what I said.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here listening, and I wonder, for those that don't normally geek out on, or maybe even non-meditators, is there something in these experiences that's worth sharing about maybe why it might be useful, or sort of bring it to a practical level? Because
I love it.
I'm with you. I mean, we both would geek out and want to have all these rich experiences, but how do we bring it back to the real world, and what's the point?
Right.
Awesome question. Thank you for bringing us back to the real world. I will say this is the real world, by the way. This is the real world, as you know. Okay. This is also my interest. This is my interest, is continually making this real and trying to ground this in practical real world stuff. So thanks for bringing me back. I end up in this place, and then I think, okay, how can I bring it around? So let me think. A couple things come to mind. You said your podcast is about the crisis of meaning in our lives, the crisis of meaning in our culture. I also agree there's a crisis of meaning. It's important that everybody asks themselves at some point in their life, what is meaningful to me? Not as an academic inquiry, but what am I doing? How am I being when a sense of meaning suffuses my experience? Because I guarantee that when that sense of meaning is suffusing your experience, you are most of service to the world around you, almost always, and you are most in your gifts. You're most in your being in some way. That's what I'm talking about. These practices bring us into that relationship with our lives. Every time, another facet on that diamond is meaning. That is literally a facet on a diamond. So anytime you are experiencing something meaningful, you are polishing that diamond. You are in that space. So what I would want to say is, I make it sound esoteric because as soon as the words come out of my mouth, it becomes a thing that we reify and think, oh, this is happening to that guy over there. But it was just my lived experience, and it's your lived experience right now. If in this conversation I said something that you just sort of went, wait a second. In that moment, you're touching that diamond. It's right there in your life. You're either going to accidentally find this out, or you're going to start to get deliberate about how to touch it more often. But if you're not getting deliberate about how to touch it, why are you here? Because everything is about that. When you're telling someone you love them, when you're caring for a child, when you're doing social justice work, you are touching that diamond. You can do it without realizing you're touching it, or you can be deliberate about it and make it a deliberate practice, and then all good flows from there. So it's where all rivers go. It's where all rivers begin.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
Yeah. We've been hitting on this, but I also want to hear a little bit about just the various process of awakening, as a, not as a singular, experience, but just, awakening from what? Because, awakening insinuates that something was asleep. And so if you can touch on, just because, like you mentioned, there are many paths and many practices, but these experiences seem universal. And it sounds like people have these common overlaps in experiences of awakening when it comes to consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think a lot about this, and I guess if I had to describe it as in the most generous, meta, universal way that it would embrace all traditions and cultures, I would say there's a process in human life, which is kind of like it's kind of like a process of puberty that you go through, but it's like a second kind of puberty period, but that happens more to fully formed adults. And that is a process of waking up to your bigger self, a larger wholeness, of understanding that you're intimately connected to the world around you and you are part of it. And you're waking up to that not as an academic idea, but as a lived experience of feeling that connection and that intimacy. And some people don't even talk about it in the sense that it's just what's happening. And they would say, yeah, that sort of happened to me, but they didn't need to make a big deal of it or call it awakening, and they didn't really notice it was just a very gradual thing. So I think that's how I often think about it, as practice is accelerating the aging gracefully gradient. If you're aging well in life, you're going to go that direction anyway. Your grandparents know people like this or are people like this, your teachers, your mentors, doctors, accountants. There's a way of aging where you're just taking your own stuff a little less seriously and letting your borders be a little more porous. So that's a process. Now that process can go it's sort of like a hockey stick. We can start to move into that process, but there is definitely a depth dimension to that process where it can get very, very, very deep. Hardcore, or I wouldn't say hardcore, but very serious spiritual practice is a way of accelerating that hockey stick and getting really clear about the deeper end of where it can lead. As they're doing that, sometimes the movement is very gradual the whole time, and it's like slowly boiling a frog. There's very little contrast. Sometimes there are discontinuous jumps where all of a sudden there's a lot of contrast. So that's what a lot of the maps are trying to get you to have, a discontinuous jump where there's a noticeable before and after. That's what a cessation is. It's what the classic path moments in Buddhism, or a big non-dual moment, like in an Advaita tradition. Oh wow, now I've had an awakening. I realize it's an awakening because you're waking up to a previous level of sleepiness. But there's always a previous level and a level of being more awake. And sometimes the problem is someone has a big jump and they go, wow, that was it. I was asleep, now I'm awake. What they don't realize is there's a lot more awakenings to come. They're like small awakenings to show you that actually you weren't as awake as you thought you were. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it ever ends. Yes. Like there's always, because you're as you're living, you're accumulating veils, you're accumulating kind of confusions, and you're awakening to them at the same time. And I don't have enough experience directly myself to know if you ever get to some place that is more permanently awake. I do know that having interviewed teachers, some teachers say, especially the non-dual types, no, that's it. You're there. Not me, them. I'm there. And maybe they are. And then other teachers who seem very there say, no, I'm never always there. And I don't know myself. I just feel like I'm always in process. But I will say I feel like I'm still low down on the hockey stick, not to put a hierarchy in it, but I recognize people who really have deep experience. And I know I have a certain depth of experience, but I also, there's a lot I don't know yet. So I'm just kind of giving you the report from what I know so far.
It's like an ever-expanding circle. I was actually just talking about that with you yesterday. Is that sometimes I think it's the same experience, but I realize, no, it feel like a lot of my experiences are around nature. And I'm like, it's the same tree, but I feel a different depth now. And it's like you're shedding a light on a different spot in your psyche or something. I don't know. It's hard to put it in language, as you said. Yeah.
I keep going. Whatever you're doing is the right practice for you, because you're describing something that's in different ways people talk about that. So there's the continual polishing of the mirror of awakening or the crystal. There's the sense of the journey going around, and you take another pass and it gets deeper. In the traditional way of conceiving the four-path model of awakening within Theravada Buddhism, the idea is that you go around these cycles of like effort, breakthrough, challenge, integration, effort, breakthrough, challenge, integration. And you go around them again and again, and then and after a while you're like, oh God, I've been here before, here again. After a while there's a shift. And then next time you go around it, you're going around it at a higher level, a level of integration, or it's a new path moment. Mm-hmm. That's when you move from first path to second path, for example, or from second path to third path. I know it sounds like a video game, it's ridiculous, but that is how actually some people think of it, for better or for worse. But the insight is more like what you're pointing to, that we go around and around, and it seems like we seem like, oh, this is now we understand it, or this is how it is. And then there's something that changes, and now we're at a deeper level of getting it. And all of a sudden, wow, now you know you're in, and that's really important to notice, because that's what that shows you that you're moving in this growth direction. And by the way, there's one big caveat, I should say, or big thing I should have said at the beginning, which is that none of these experiences necessarily are the thing to look for.
Yes.
In your practice in life.
And that's important to mention, yes.
It's super important. What matters is, are you more in your life? Are you growing in the way you want to grow? Are you more connected to your friends, your whoever? Like, don't chase these experiences, and the experiences themselves they just come and go. The litmus test of any successful practice is always, are you growing in the way you want to grow in a very reasonable, practical way? Are you more present, more loving, more available? And you should have a litmus test. You should have an idea in your head of an intention around what it is you want for your life. And that's kind of the feedback loop that you're using.
Absolutely. And that's, again, it's about bringing it back to the practical and the real world. Yeah.
Totally.
That's awesome, Jeff. I'm just being mindful of time, maybe like 10 minutes left. And I'd love to also touch on society, mindfulness in society. So outside of the individual, but looking at sort of the collective reasons why it's important to have individual practices. I read in one of your articles, you talked about the democratization of mental health. And I'd love to hear your vision of this, because it sounds like it's linked to your role as a teacher and empowering students to develop their own skills and tools to take control of their mental well-being.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. That is my absolute passion. And it's sort of like where that's my learning edge right now as a teacher. Or you can kind of think about yourself as a So my whole thing is to actually dissolve the difference between practitioner and teacher. And actually, even beyond that, to dissolve the difference between practitioner, teacher, and just regular human. That I kind of want to say that being a teacher, I wish there was a better word for it, is really the ultimate human thing to be. And that the more we realize that, and that it's not exotic, and that although there are definitely people who have more and less experience, insofar as we can be honest about our own challenges and who we are in the role of a teacher at that moment, and that our own practice is the ultimate creative thing to discover and then to share. So that's my vision, and I'm just trying to learn to articulate it. In the progression of from practitioner to teacher to more experienced teacher, I started out just about learning the skills. What was I doing? I got good at teaching the skills to other people. And that's kind of like the consolidated back end of my moving process. That is Jeff. And that's now beginning to support me to be able to do with the front end, which is, actually the next layer out is this larger service to all, and this empowerment to make everybody a teacher, to remove this idea that somehow this teacher is special, and to see that in the way I just described, when we are in a place of honesty about who we are and where we're at, we're in that role. And that I want to be able to teach people what is the basic stuff around mental, spiritual, emotional health that everyone should know, in the same way that everyone should know the basics of healthy nutrition and the basics of good exercise. So that's my thing now. It's like, okay, what are those things? And how do I do that? How do I impart that in a way that's responsible and safe and respects the fraught territory of mental, emotional health, which is serious. But at the same time, if we get too worried about the fraught territory of it, then we leave the territory only for specialists, and we don't have enough of those specialists to go around. And to talk about the world today, there's a crisis in mental health. There are teen suicide rates are through the roof. There are people with major technology addictions. Just like there's an environmental crisis in the external world, there's an inner environmental crisis.
Absolutely.
Where everything is coming apart, and we need to put all hands on deck. So we don't have time to get it perfect. And it's more important to have an amateur guide than to have no guide at all. And so I'm all about putting myself on the line by saying that and trying to create programs and empower people. And it's true, I'm an empowerment teacher. I'm about saying, do it. So I have the free community resources on the CEC website that I just wrote that are all about empowering people to start up practice groups. I have a workshop I'm doing now that I'm just starting to do with a friend of mine that's about teaching, like, over the weekend, what can I teach that I think is most important for people? And then I get them to iterate, learning, figuring out a practice to share and guiding others, and getting a feel for what that looks like. And then always with the understanding that the person in front of you is a different nervous system, and you have to also be always teaching that pluralism and that respect for their own teacherness.
Yeah, we'll definitely share a lot of those links in the show notes for people that want to get involved and are equally excited about this. You talked about teens, actually. I'm curious to hear your experience teaching young adults, who are going through a ton of life transition, I imagine. And what is that like, bringing the practice to the youth and, the next generation of leaders?
It's you gave me goosebumps just thinking about it. It's the greatest, it's the greatest honor and privilege of my life, because you see kids at this moment in life where it's about to go off the rails, and all of a sudden it turns a corner.
Wow.
And you just see their life change right in front of you, and it's not anything you're even doing; it's something they're doing, and it mostly comes from sharing and talking and checking in with each other and being in a safe place where the armor can come off. And it's like overwhelming. Sometimes it's such a privilege, and I could just be there as a fly on the wall. It's the most humbling experience too, because it's my biggest teacher, because I'm learning, and in those contexts they teach me to be more honest about who I am, and they show me the privilege of just holding the space, of not being the guy with the answers or some special teacher. I'm just the wallpaper. Mm-hmm. And it's that humility is like, you can't even, it's priceless, so
that's really special. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it's amazing, because you see, like, it's not even that they're doing tons of meditation. It's more like you're continually bringing the principles of openness, and you're creating a space where those are such high values that they start to get in the sharing with each other more and more real and honest. And that's where all the healing comes. It's not so much for the sitting. The sitting is good too, but it's really just that.
Absolutely.
And you can't put too much sitting into a teenage retreat. They got too much juice. You don't want them to be sitting all the time. It's not good for a teenager. I mean,
yeah. Jeff, would you mind actually leading us through a bit of a closing meditation? We thought it'd be nice to leave the listeners as well. Maybe you can do a quick close.
Yeah. I'd love to. Thank you for asking me. Can I do like a 10-minute practice?
Yeah, that'd be great.
That would be amazing.
So what about, I had this idea, what if I start with the equanimity principle, the principle that's there in every vehicle and and try to tune people into that quality, because that's the one thing I want people to be able to remember. And then I'll go a little bit into the concentration principle, this principle of devoting yourself and learning how to bring your resources together. And there's a principle of simplicity in that's so important. And then finish it with a kind of love or compassion principle. Beautiful. So just 3 principles, exploring 3 principles, how they might show up in a sitting practice or in moment to moment.
Perfect.
And if you're driving, don't do this practice except in a very light way.
Yeah.
Just connect to the spirit of it. If you're driving, make the cars and sights and sounds around you of driving the practice. Just in case we don't want to have a 10-car pileup. that would not be good. Whoops. Okay. So you can start by, if you like, having your eyes kind of open at half-mast or closed. It's really about where you feel comfortable, like what makes you feel kind of comfortable, because that's what we're aiming for here. And I like to start with just a couple of breaths, kind of, indicate to my body-mind that meditation's starting. So breathing in on the inhale, breathing out on the exhale, sort of softening the face and the jaw. And that exhale is like the relaxation, the downward motion. And because I was all stirred up and activated there, talking about stuff I was interested in, I can feel there's a lot of energy and agitation in my system. There might be some in yours. So as we breathe out, just imagine you're kind of like a snow globe. All that snow is settling and you're kind of breathing out. As you breathe out, the sediment starts to come down. And let's explore this first principle of equanimity. This is a principle of opening. It's about being available to what's actually happening in experience. And there's a palpable feeling of it. There's a kind of palpable sense of it we might get. And often we get it in relationship to something. So I want to ask you to see if in relationship to my voice, See if you can imagine my voice is just a sound wave that's floating right through you. So if there's any bracing, any subtle way in which you're braced against my voice, or you're kind of tense through the front of your body, see if you can just let go of that. And open your body through the front of your body, opening so that you're welcoming not only my voice, but any ambient sounds and where you're listening. You're welcoming your own, any sensations in your body, even your own thoughts. It's like you're kind of letting go, and there's a sort of settling back and letting everything else just come forward and be there, and you're not interfering with it. That tiny adjustment, that whatever it is you just did there, that's the thing to notice. This thing of, if there's only one thing to learn here, it's like that. Do this all the time. Every moment of the day, stop and let go and breathe and just let yourself come more fully into the present. Not fighting with, in subtle ways, with what's around you, what's moving through you. It feels like openness for me. It feels like not being uptight. So the next principle is the principle of commitment, devotion, concentration, simplicity. They're all ways of talking about the similar thing, which is that we choose something in our experience. Maybe it's the feeling of the breath, or the sense of our whole body just sitting here, sense of the whole container of everything. Maybe it's sounds. So the thing we devote ourselves to can be very wide. It could be everything, or it could be very narrow, just the sensation of breathing at the nose or in the belly. And we see if we can notice the softest, subtlest part of whatever that is that we want to devote ourselves to. And we let our thoughts be in the background as best we can. We see if we can, as an experiment, can you bring all qualities of your attention, can they all converge on this one juicy thing? And one of the keys to this is to find the softest part, the subtlest part, to get curious about that. The curiosity builds our awareness, our discernment, our clarity. And there's this delicacy in attention. Can you let your breath slow down just naturally, get very still, and very delicately feel into the softest part of the sensation, even if it's the big, quote, sensation of your own being. And let the face be soft. No strain. As we get close to the end of this little mini meditation, maybe even let a small smile sort of crack on your lips. Because the last piece here is about appreciation. It's about love, about caring. Starting with your own experience. Can you smile in a way that's appreciative of whatever sensations, whatever is going on? Like you're your own caregiver. You're your own mother or father, secretly delighted by these sensations and feelings, even the hard ones. And let the smile expand and the kindness, that friendliness overflow into images or thoughts of people that you know, people you're close to, mentors, old teachers, ancestors, grandmothers, pets and animals, friends. So you breathing in your respect as if you could breathe it into your heart, and breathing out your care. Breathing in your gratitude for these connections, the sweetness. These are them. These are the people. This is what showed up in your life. Breathing in your thanks. And breathing out your care, sending them your love, your respect, your appreciation. And this is sort of the Indra's net piece. This idea that we're in this interconnected web through time and space, connected through generations. And we breathe in energy through that web, that net, breathing it into our hearts, gathering in that energy as strength, as support, and then breathing out your own care and respect back through that same network. Giving away the blessings of this short practice, not holding on to it for yourself, but sharing the wealth. Thank you. I'll just bow down to you guys. If I had a bell, I'd ring it. There's a little short practice for you.
Amazing.
It was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. A swath of pelicans suspended from a red morning sky, their wings entangled and their beaks broken. Your mother, whom you have not seen in years, still reeks of grief. And you are a young boy, unfettered by the noise of wet tears and absent lovers. But your eyes, they acquiesce to those who live from their heart. You learn discomfort is inevitable and it is all impermanent. So drop in with me. Let's go inside. Where do you feel it? Yes. There, your broken heart resides. There, where I end and you begin. There. Where do you feel it?
We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find links and show notes at soulspacepodcast.com. Next episode, I chat with former NBA strength coach Drew Cleary about the psychology of optimal performance. Follow us on social media at SoulspacePod, that's SoulspacePod. And please leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.